Okay, so let's talk about my layout for my game Avarice. This is the layout, and currently I have it split into 6 sections. The green outline section is the player introductory area. It will be where most of the teaching goes on, and right above it is the purple section, which is the heart of my level. The player will have to return to this section multiple times before they're done. Right above it is the yellow outlined area. This is another teaching area, but for the most part, the game is starting to pick up. Like more enemy combat. The player learns how to heal and refill its canteen. Excuse me. All while picking up an item that allows it to move blocks. So the player is also going to learn how the boxes interact with like physics and everything like that, along with an enemy introduction. So it's going to learn about a new enemy while it's here as well. Connected to that is a orange area, and there's 2 orange areas on each side. The orange areas are areas that the player goes to once it picks up the moving box item, and they're important to the overall objective, which I can now pull up objectives here. So there's 2 fountains represented by teal dots on each side, and each fountain must be turned on for the player to get to its main objective, which is getting the crest that's in the central purple area. So after those 2 orange areas that you can go to, there is a dark orange area called what I call the escape. Essentially, once the player completes its first main objective of getting the crest, the player must now escape because the way that it entered is no longer open to them. So they go through a amphitheater section before they can exit out back into where the player initially started. So yeah. So let's talk about teaching for a moment. So in the starting area, the player needs to learn a few key things like moving. It needs to know how to jump. It also needs to know how to climb ledges. All that's taught in there. Along in there is also a potential teaching moment. I don't strictly teach. I don't strictly show up like have a text or anything that pops up and says this is an environmental hazard. But an environmental hazard is in this area. There's just the player could or could not run into it, so I don't necessarily list it here. But we move on to what I would call the more it's the entrance, the official entrance to the cemetery, and it's blocked by a rusty gate that the player has to attack to open. So it teaches the player how to attack. Immediately following that will be an enemy, and we'll see that once I switch when I talk about enemies. An enemy, will immediately attack the player, and from there a dodge prompt will show up to teach the player about dodging, and then this also serves as an introduction to to the first enemy that the player will see, the most basic enemy. As the let's take a step back from this, actually, from teaching. Let's see where the player can actually go. So before the player can get gains the ability to move boxes, they're pretty limited on where they can go. Like there's these 2 areas off to the side that they can go to, but for the most part, everything else is just completely blocked off to them except for this yellow section. I kept these open because I wanted the player to be able to like explore some, but at the same time, I needed to stop them at some point. So I was like, okay, you can enter the area, but you can't really do anything. I wanted to make it obvious that something else had to be done. Like in this case, right here, there's this orange block here. The orange blocks on the ground purely represent where a moving block will be and where it can be moved. So anywhere that's not orange, so like in this green like circular area, the box can't move there. It can only move in the orange area. So obviously there's going to be a moving block there, and the player can't do anything about it. So they'll either have to backtrack and maybe look around some more, or they'll just make progression through the yellow area. So the moment that they get the gloves that we saw in the main objective screen here, the gloves, their options immediately open up, and they're able to, for the most part, except for the escape and the crest section of the central room, they can go anywhere they want. But let's go back to teaching. So they do the treasure distraction tutorial. The player is faced with two of the basic enemies. A nearby crypt opens up, and just a bunch of treasure falls out of it, and the enemies will be distracted, giving the player an opportunity to kill them, or I guess defeat them, E10 plus, by the way, but also observe how the enemies interact with treasure. Obviously, it's a distraction to them, so maybe the player can use that. And from this point, that's when they gain the ability to use the treasure that they will be collecting along the way to help them in combat. We go through two enemy encounters, and then we show the player rather how to heal, and then how to refill its canteen if it had the heal. So there's a little tutorial there, and then we obviously give the player the gloves to be able to pull objects, and there's a whole section right here that reuses space about like having to push a block down from a cliff that lands in this orange area here, and then they use that block to get back up, stuff like that. But from that point, teaching is pretty much done. So there isn't, besides like expanding on like how objects interact with each other, teaching is for the most part done. So let's go back to the objectives. The main objective now is, once the player entered in from the green area, it's not shown in the layout here, but there'll be a door right here that leads upstairs. So it's like a gate. It looks very similar to the gate that the player had to attack to open, to get into the cemetery. So they need to find a way to open that gate, and the solution to that is these two fountains. Each area they have to have their puzzle solved to turn on the fountain. In the left side here, the solution to that is there is 3 maiden statues, more like 2.5 though, because one of the 3 will be broken, and in each of their hands, except for the broken one, is a cube that the player has to both bring to the ground and then put into the hole that is beneath the statue to turn it on. And to illustrate this, once the player enters that area, on the broken statue, the box will already be plugged into the hole, showing the player what it needs to do. And then later on, in order to get to one of the 2 statues, the player has to either get the other box from the other statue, or it can unplug the box that's already plugged into the broken statue and use that to get to the area, which is right here, which has the path to the that second box. The other one is straightforward. There's just combat. Essentially, both areas have combat, but this one, there's no need for any like fiddling around with other boxes to get it. So once that fountain is turned on, well, actually no, let's take a step back. Once the first block, either one doesn't matter, once the first block is pushed off one of the statues and it hits the ground beneath it is going to crack. Purely art for the most part, for now. But once the player gets to the second block and pushes that one down, it's going to crack further, along with summoning enemies. So there's going to be about 4 of them that summon at this point, in the central area that they will have to deal with before they can solve the puzzle. Once that's done, they plug all the boxes into the holes beneath the statues, and the fountain will turn on. As the fountain turns on, the ground beneath the statue that was cracked previously gives way. And that's when we go to layout number 2 here. This blue section, if you pay attention to that, it gives way to this, like, not necessarily a cavern, but, there's earth and a bunch of thorn environmental hazards beneath it that the player has to watch for. But that's essentially their way out. It's not the only way out, but I thought it was a nice tie to be like, hey, your objective is done. You can leave now, type of thing. And here's something really cool that happens at the same time. Should the player choose to, they could just take this path down here and then just leave. But for the most part, this is there to bring it home that, hey, you're done. You can leave now, type of thing. And that unlocks this path to get out. So this path right here, and we talked about it with the like player options, the reason they can't get to any of these sections is because this will be blocked off, and this is a one-way cliff. So once the player leaves via this route, once they jump down here, they're not able to get back up. So they'll have to go all the way back over here and then get back in if they want to, continue. So that's one fountain down. I want water flowing from this fountain, and I want it to flow towards the doorway, or I guess the gate, to illustrate that, hey, this is affecting this, type of thing. So, maybe go on the other side and do that thing. So we go to the second fountain here, and the overarching puzzle for this area is essentially create your path. So once the player enters right here, they're just going to see thorns, just a lot of environmental thorns, and they have to push this block in to proceed, which illustrates to them that they need to push blocks into these thorns. It'll land and squash any thorns that are beneath it, thus creating a path forward. So they'll push a block in, and then the only way forward will be up here, and there'll be 2 blocks they need to push in. And these blue blocks here illustrate where they will land once the player pushes them in. And they have to proceed to get the 2 here, the 1 on the opposite side, and it's kind of hard to see in the shot, but there's 1 on the bridge right here. So yeah. So once they do that, it goes... Actually, I can bring up the critical path here. Critical path, that's kind of messy, but essentially... They do it. They proceed across, and then the way forward is here. This is a one-way, so the player couldn't initially come up here if they wanted to. It's a one-way and allows them at this point to cross along the create a path section, and they get to the fountain. This fountain activates very similarly to the first one, where there's a single maiden statue here, and all you have to do is you push in the block, and it activates the fountain. But at this point, this is where, because we already activated this first fountain, I believe I have it set up so there's 5 enemies that spawn here. And we'll get into the more dynamic spawning thing when we talk about enemies. But yeah, so 5, at this current moment, 5 will spawn here, and the player has to defeat them, and then get back to the central area, and then pick up the crest, and you get out of there. Pretty straightforward. The only thing I'm really skipping over at the moment is the player looting crypts. I currently don't have that in at the moment, along with deciding how much treasure the player gets per area. That's something I'm working on next, but it's just something I don't have. Let's see here. So we did teaching, objectives. I think we're ready to talk about enemies. So I have 2 types of enemies. One is a rotter, which is your generic, skeleton or zombie enemy. You could play any game with one of these, and by the end you've killed like hundreds or thousands of them. So they take 2 hits from the player to defeat. Their general melee attack deals 1 damage. They have a lunge attack, which is telegraphed, which deals 2 damage. And then they have a guarding/patrolling AI. I wasn't at the time sure how to describe this, but I don't necessarily want either of these at the same time. My main idea is I want them to be in a spot, and I don't just want them sitting there guarding, or I don't want them sitting like patrolling like a soldier. I kind of want them to maybe like wander around a little bit, but for the most part I couldn't think of the word to describe that. It's, I guess, wandering AI, maybe. While at the same time, the player has a throw treasure mechanic that because of that tutorial. So in order to to distract a rodder, it requires a single use, or I call a small pile of treasure, to distract it. I believe I have it set up so if the player uses the ability once, he's able to, or I guess they are able to, distract 2 rodder enemies at the same time. So that's good. The second enemy is the behemoth. The behemoth is a very large enemy, and thus it takes twice as many hits to defeat. But the damage it deals is very similar. So it's general melee attack, just like the rodder does 1. Charge attack. The only difference is the difference between the lunge and the charge attack. The charge attack is done from larger range, but other than that, it's pretty much the same. This one, however, I do want to have guarding AI. I think that's pretty important. I don't think I really want it to be wandering around. However, that could probably change. This one, however, requires a medium pile of treasure to distract. So in my mind, that requires 2 uses of the throw treasure mechanic. So the mechanic works as you can throw some treasure onto the ground, and then you can press the button again, and it just keeps adding to that pile of treasure. So 2 uses would turn it from a small pile to a medium pile, and thus being able to distract a behemoth. However, the difference is a medium pile can only distract 1 behemoth, compared to a small pile distracting 2 rodders. So yeah. So with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the dynamic system. So in my level, like I said earlier, the player could choose to go to the right side, the right orange area, if it wanted to, rather than the left, even though currently my game suggests they go to the left. In the end, it doesn't matter, and I want to balance it that way. So if the player does decide to follow the suggestion of the geometry and it goes to the left side orange area, once it turns on the fountain, that's when the difficulty for the right side, the creative path section, is going to increase. So what would have been let's say they went to the right side first instead, if they turned that fountain on, that encounter would have been 3 or 4 enemies, but because they turned on the left side fountain first, that encounter turned into 6 enemies, something like that, So that's how I want to be able to balance it so they both have a similar amount of difficulty, while at the same time try to increase the difficulty, because they've completed technically half the map at this point, so it should get more difficult rather than just plateauing. So that's something I will have to think about a little more, but for the most part, this is my game plan. It's not the dynamic system isn't very well illustrated here, but that's why I'm talking a little bit more about it rather than actual placement. However, something I do need to talk about is the escape section of its enemy spawns. Because it's an amphitheater, I wanted a lot more enemies to be in the area, and I wanted it to be noticeable that there's a difficulty increase. You should be able to tell, hey, the game is getting harder, but in this section, you should be oh, okay. Not punishingly so, but more difficult, okay, this just turned up a little bit. If a difficulty increase between the first fountain area and the second fountain area is turning the knob from 8 to 9, I want this to go from 9 to 11 then, right? I want 2 notches rather than just a single notch. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Really trying to focus on making the difficulty independent of whether the player goes left or right first. I think that's key, at least for the time being. I may change it. I have some ideas about how I could change this level up, but for the most part, I think I've meddled with that enough. So we'll see how it goes after maybe some playtesting. But yeah, I'm really excited for it. Is there anything I'm missing here? I guess we could go back to the critical path for a moment. It's a little messy though. So yeah, let me change this real quick actually. Oh, excuse me. Critical path here. I really hope this works. Why is it? Uh-oh. Well, that's never a good sign. Okay, I guess we're stuck with this. So actually, let me get my pen out. Is this working? Hello? Oh, it's not working. Very bad. So, essentially, this is the initial path. As difficult as it is to see, let me turn off enemies. This is the initial path that the player takes before it has to split. So, in this case, the player will have to go a specific way, no matter what, up until they grab the gloves and they get out of the pit that they learn in, sort of. So, this is one of the potential paths, and both paths look very similar because, I mean, the critical path is the same for each area. It's just what matters, what changes how it looks is which one you go to first. Like this versus this. Like if you can... That's pretty difficult to see, but you kind of get the idea. For the most part, it's the same. You just gotta, you know, just make a decision. That's it. Just give the player a decision, and yeah, and don't punish them too much because they made the wrong one, I guess. But yeah, I think that's it. I think I've explained everything to a degree. We've got objectives, teaching, enemies, player options was a thing. Yeah, I think we're good here. So yeah, that was my layout for Avarice. White box currently, but we'll see how that goes.